The Battle of Red Cliffs, one of history's largest naval battles, sees hundreds of thousands locked into a deadly struggle. Chinese warlord Cao Cao, desperate to outnumber his enemy, enlists infantry and cavalry as sailors. But this big brain move doesn't go as expected. The motion of the ocean causes mass seasickness, with rookie sailors hurling over the side of the swaying ships. But Cao Cao is a man with a plan. He chains his fleet together, hoping to stop the swaying. Instead, he creates an easy target, and his enemy sets the entire fleet ablaze, turning his grand strategy into a fiery disaster. As far as war blunders go, that is pretty legendary. But things are about to get a whole lot dumber on today's episode of The Infographic Show. The dumbest war mistakes ever made. Number 11. Making promises you can't keep. The First World War cost France a staggering toll, around 1.4 million. The sheer scale of this loss hung heavy over the country. So when French Commander-in-Chief Robert Nivelle promised his troops an audacious plan in spring 1917, it must have felt like hope was finally on the horizon. Nivelle declared that the French forces would achieve one of two dramatic outcomes at Chemin des Dames: either a lightning advance that would break the German lines, or a swift withdrawal within 2 days if things suddenly went south. That was a promise. And let's face it, if the French perfected one thing, it's a dramatic exit. The French forces launched their assault on Chemin des Dames. It was a battle they believed would end decisively within 2 days. But as hours turned into days, things started to look grim. If you were a French soldier, you'd be counting down the minutes, waiting for the withdrawal order. It had to come. Nivelle promised it. But then, nothing. No orders, no retreat, just the realization that Nivelle ghosted. If there is one thing we know about France, it's that breaking promises doesn't go over well. Nivelle had clearly forgotten the fate of Louis XVI and his date with the guillotine in 1793. Lucky for Nivelle, his punishment wasn't nearly so dramatic. Instead, he faced a mutiny. Around half of his soldiers decided they'd had enough, telling him that they would defend, but their days of attacking were over. One broken promise put the entire country at risk. Germany never caught wind of the mutiny brewing in the French ranks during the spring of 1917. If it had, the Germans might have seized the perfect moment to counterattack, but they didn't, and France somehow managed to claw its way into capturing parts of Chemin des Dames. That said, the grand victory Nivelle promised never showed up. France wasted no time in swapping out the embattled commander-in-chief for Philippe Pétain, who brought a steadier hand to the helm. As for Nivelle, his legacy wasn't exactly glowing. Some historians remember him as a disastrous choice, while others, well, they don't remember him at all. Still, at least the French mutineers were getting paid. That is way more than we could say for our next dumb war mistake. Number 10. Paying your sailors with IOUs. It's hard to imagine staying loyal to a leader who only pays you in promises, but that is exactly what England's King Charles II expected from his sailors in 1667, even as the Dutch sailed their fleet of warships right up the Thames. Saying Charles II wasn't a financial genius might be the understatement of the century. In a secret deal with Louis XIV of France, he promised to convert to Catholicism for a hefty sum. The cash started to roll in, but instead of using it to fund the soldiers he pledged for France's war against the Dutch, Charles splurged on himself. After all, why win a war when you can win at accessorizing? So, when the Dutch sailed up the Thames and reached the Medway, where the English fleet was anchored, Charles' sailors didn't exactly leap into the action. As cannon fire tore through the British ships, many of them were nowhere to be found, and those who did show up weren't exactly in a hurry to climb aboard their doomed vessels. After months of being paid with IOUs, morale wasn't exactly sky high. Slips of paper promising future payment does not put food on the table, and the English sailors decided they'd had enough. In a twist worthy of a Netflix drama, a few even switched sides, joining the Dutch in the hope of earning actual money. 3 of England's 4 great ships were scuttled. The Royal Charles was snatched by the Dutch, and the British Navy suffered one of its most humiliating defeats. The only reason this fiasco isn't higher on the list is that England managed to recover and fend off the Dutch. Still, Charles's spending spree is a textbook example of how costly a little royal hubris can be. And that overconfidence is something he shares with our next military masterminds. Number 9. The overconfident failure in Cannae. It's 216 BC, and the Roman Empire is in the thick of its second war with the North African state of Carthage. Hannibal and his mercenary forces had already pulled off an audacious invasion of Italy via the Alps, complete with elephants, and they rampaged through the Italian countryside. Along the way, they'd inflicted over 50,000 casualties on Rome. But Rome had a plan. Delay Hannibal's forces long enough to raise the largest army in its history. Then, armed with their sheer numbers, Rome would face off against Hannibal at Cannae, ready to crush him under the sheer weight of its massive legions. On papyrus, it looked like a pretty good idea, and the numbers game worked out well. By the time Rome geared up for the Battle of Cannae, it had amassed 80,000 soldiers and 6,000 cavalry, dwarfing Hannibal's 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. August 2nd arrived, and the two armies squared off on the dusty plains of Cannae. This was the moment where Rome's overconfidence truly took center stage, and the stage was set for a brutal lesson. Despite watching Hannibal obliterate their armies and terrorize Italy, Rome stuck to its usual playbook. They formed up their traditional block formation, a dense mass of infantry in the center with cavalry guarding the flanks. They planned to use brute force and overwhelming numbers to push through Hannibal's lines. The problem was Hannibal had seen all of this before, and larger numbers weren't going to faze him. Hannibal arranged his forces in an irregular formation, perfectly baiting the Romans' generals' overconfidence. What hope could he possibly have against the might of the Roman army? Plenty, as it turned out. Hannibal created a crescent-shaped battle line, instructing his infantry to feign a retreat toward the center of his formation. Rome fell for it, believing they were watching Hannibal's forces crumble. The Romans charged straight into the crescent at full speed. But it was a trap. By the time Rome's generals realized their mistake, it was too late. The edges of the crescent folded inward, encircling the Roman forces. Meanwhile, Hannibal's cavalry drove off the Roman cavalry, leaving their infantry exposed. The crescent became a deadly circle. Trapped in the center, Rome's foot soldiers found themselves fighting a losing battle as the Carthaginians attacked from every side. The trap was so expertly executed that Rome's central infantry was packed in too tightly to even swing their swords. The chaos turned into a crushing melee, resulting in the largest defeat in Rome's history. Between 50,000 and 70,000 of Rome's finest were lost, all because its generals couldn't imagine that Hannibal's army wouldn't just turn and flee. To their credit, they weren't entirely wrong. Superior numbers usually do win battles, just not this one. If only Britain's Lord Herbert Kitchener had heeded that advice during his disastrous effort in Gallipoli. Mistake number 8. A quick cuppa and you miss the fight. 150,000 men. That's the number Greece told Britain it would take to overwhelm the Turkish fortress at Gallipoli. Not because the Turks were unbeatable warriors, far from it, but because the terrain was a nightmare. Cliffsides, narrow beaches, and rocky outcrops turned any full frontal assault into a logistical disaster waiting to happen. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, had already learned the hard way how daunting Gallipoli was. He'd previously tried to sail an aging fleet of 18 British warships through the Dardanelles to reach Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. The forts of the Gallipoli Peninsula battered his ships into a retreat, sinking 5 along the way. If that wasn't warning enough, Greece's advice about needing 150,000 soldiers should have been. Britain's Secretary of State, Lord Herbert Kitchener, thought all of this was just nonsense. Confident the Turks would flee at the first sight of Allied forces, he tasked General Sir Ian Hamilton with planning an amphibious landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Nothing says military genius like basing an entire operation on pure wishful thinking. Reaching the beaches of Gallipoli was not the hard part. The British soldiers rowed ashore on small lifeboats with little trouble. But the moment they stepped onto land, the nightmare began. Turkish machine guns opened fire, tearing through the advancing troops. Of the first 200 soldiers to land, only 21 made it to the beach. The rest were cut down almost instantly. It was another red flag that was ignored. The British, along with their Australian and New Zealand Army Corps allies, ANZAC, kept pushing ashore. Around 2,000 British soldiers landed on a spot called Y Beach, undefended and seemingly safe. With no communication from General Hamilton, stationed so far offshore on the HMS Queen Elizabeth that he couldn't see the battle, let alone issue orders, the troops made the best of it. They hunkered down and, in true British fashion, enjoyed a few cups of tea, to the backdrop of the distant sound of gunfire. With no orders, there wasn't much else to do. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Gallipoli Peninsula, ANZAC soldiers were fighting for their lives. More than 10,000 Australian and New Zealand soldiers were killed or maimed in the chaos. Hamilton was so clueless about the blunder that he even told Lord Kitchener, "Thanks to the weather and the wonderfully fine spirit of our troops, all continues to go well." It was a disaster, and it was only getting worse. The next 8 months consisted of brutal trench warfare that eventually led to the Allied forces withdrawing. 500,000 men died in the standoff, and it could have all been avoided If the 2,000 soldiers on Y Beach had received the order to flank the machine guns on the high ground that were tearing through the ANZAC troops. Next up, we come to another army that believed it could win because of superior numbers. Number 7. The Battle of Agincourt. We've already seen what happens when an army overestimates its numbers advantage. Just look at Rome's disastrous failure against Hannibal. But apparently the French forces fighting England in the Hundred Years' War missed that memo, and really, why would they? A millennium had passed and overconfidence has never gone out of style. Outnumbering England's forces by up to 5-1, France commanded 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers against an English army of just 6,000. The battle seemed as good as won. All they had to do was charge. Their superior numbers would take care of the rest. Or so they thought. But the French overlooked one crucial detail, the English longbow. And that is where France's mistakes began. They underestimated everything about this weapon, its accuracy, its rate of fire, and its range. The French thought they could Gallic shrug their way through a storm of arrows. They'd still have the numbers to take the fight to the English and overwhelm them. The charge might have succeeded if it wasn't for some more French miscalculations. The battlefield had turned into a muddy mess after weeks of rain, bogging down French troops as they struggled to advance. As they struggled to move, English archers took full advantage, unleashing hails of arrows on soldiers and horses stuck in the muck. And for the cavalry who did manage to push through, the English had one more unpleasant surprise: sharpened wooden stakes perfectly angled to bring charging horses to a sudden stop. Riders who somehow made it past found themselves unhorsed and face to face with the sharp end of England's infantry. France's infantry followed the cavalry into the fight, but things didn't get any better. They ended up crammed together like sardines, unable to swing their weapons properly. By the time they pushed past England's archers, they were so beaten down that they didn't stand a chance. France lost around 6,000 soldiers, including plenty of nobles, while England only lost about 400. Thousands of French soldiers just ran for it. These blunders gave England the upper hand, letting them take Normandy and eventually forcing France into the humiliating Treaty of Troyes. Still, for all the mistakes France made, at least its soldiers weren't turning on each other. That's what nearly happened when the United States put its own president in the crosshairs. Number 6. Firing a torpedo at Franklin D. Roosevelt. Adolf Hitler and his Axis allies would have given anything for a shot at taking out the U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt during World War II. But they never got close. Turns out they didn't have to. The U.S. nearly did the job for them. The story begins in July 1943 with the commissioning of the USS William D. Porter, affectionately nicknamed the Willie D., a brand new $6 million ship with an equally green crew. It somehow found itself assigned to a prestigious mission, escorting the USS Iowa to the Tehran Conference. On board the USS Iowa were President Franklin D. Roosevelt, U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and top military commanders. Their destination was a high-stakes meeting with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill at the Tehran Conference. The Willie D. quickly proved itself to be the bumbling sidekick in a real-life comedy of errors. The mistakes started happening before the ships even set sail. During a routine maneuver at the port, the Willie D.'s inexperience made an immediate splash. Literally. While reversing alongside another ship, it bumped into the other vessel's anchor, tearing off railings and sending lifeboats plunging to the sea. Amazingly, the Willie D. itself emerged unscathed, leaving behind a trail of chaos and some very confused sailors. It was a sign of things to come. As the Willie D. set out on its journey to Algeria, it unwittingly began a reign of terror, not on the enemy, but on its own convoy. During a training exercise, when the inexperienced crew managed to drop a live depth charge overboard, the resulting explosion rocked the entire convoy, sending every ship into frantic anti-submarine maneuvers. It wasn't until the ship's crew managed to get a message through that it wasn't a German attack. They had just forgotten to secure the safety on the depth charge. And the blunders kept on a-coming. At one point during the journey, President Roosevelt decided he wanted to test the fleet's aerial defenses. The USS Iowa launched a series of balloons, giving the surrounding ships the chance to work on their target practice. On board the Willie D., the crew eagerly joined in, with sailors heading to the lower decks to simulate firing torpedoes at the Iowa. But then it happened. the Willie D accidentally fired a torpedo with its primer still in place. A live torpedo went careening toward the USS Iowa, the ship carrying the President of the United States. Thankfully, the Willie D's crew had apparently skipped the Aiming 101 course and somehow managed to miss the massive American battleship entirely. The Willie D's torpedo man, Lawton Dawson, admitted his mistake and was sentenced to 14 years of hard labor, though Roosevelt revoked the sentence soon after. But hey, at least his friendly fire incident didn't kill anybody. That's more than we can say for our next dumb war blunder. Number 5. Friendly fire at the Battle of Cannae. If there is one thing you don't do to soldiers itching for a fight, it's get them drunk. A bit of Dutch courage might help on the battlefield, but turn it into an all-out bar brawl among your troops, and things are gonna go sideways fast. That's basically what happened in 1788 during the Battle of Cannae. In the second year of the Austro-Turkish War, Austria sent its scouts across the river Danube under the cover of night. Their mission was simple: look around and see if they could spot any of the Ottoman Empire's positions. Instead, the scouts stumbled across a group of Tsigan, Romani people from Eastern Europe who had an interesting proposition. They offered to sell the scouts a few barrels of schnapps. The scouts didn't hesitate. Mission forgotten. They got their hands on the hooch and proceeded to get completely wasted. A short while later, some Austrian infantrymen found the scouts, and they weren't happy. Not because their scouting troop had failed in their mission, but because the infantry wanted in on the schnapps too. When the scouts refused, a fight broke out. Things escalated quickly. Somebody fired a gun, and in the drunken confusion, the drunken soldiers turned their guns on each other. As if that wasn't messy enough, someone, likely one of the more drunker troops, screamed, "Turks! Turks!" Panic ensued. The scouts and the infantrymen bolted back to their camps only to find that they'd sparked full-blown chaos in the darkness. The problem was that the Austrian army was a melting pot of soldiers from across Europe. Germans, Austrians, Italians, Czechs, Croats, and more were all thrown together, many of whom couldn't understand each other. So, when they were ordered to halt, most of the soldiers simply had no idea what it meant. They kept on fighting with their own comrades. It got even worse when an Austrian corps commander mistook what was going on in the camp for a Turkish cavalry attack. He ordered his soldiers to fire on the camp with artillery, killing hundreds in the melee. In the end, a group of wasted Austrian scouts sparked a massive battle that claimed the lives of over 10,000 men, and not a single one of them was Turkish. By the time Austria realized it had spent the night fighting itself, its forces in Cannae was nearly wiped out. When Turkish soldiers finally arrived a few days later, they found little resistance. The city practically fell into their hands. The moral of the story is, alcohol and war don't mix. And that's a lesson the English learned over 100 years before the Austrian camp brawl. Number 4. The Drunken Cadiz Expedition. It was 1625, and the English were feeling pretty good about themselves. Just under 40 years earlier, they managed to decimate the feared Spanish Armada, killing 15,000 Spanish soldiers and destroying Spain's reputation as the world's leading naval power. Maybe it was time to recapture the glory with a raid on Spain. The port city of Cadiz was chosen as the target, and the English set sail with a 10,000-strong force under Sir Edward Cecil's command. We say force, but in reality many of those who made the journey were criminals, with around 10% deemed unfit for service due to illness or age. Still, the soldiers managed to land successfully and even stumbled their way into taking the fort of Puntal. Granted, the fort hardly took a scratch from the 2,000 rounds fired by the British ships. The soldiers on the ground did the heavy lifting, but hey, a win is a win, right? When Cecil thought he heard an approaching Spanish army, he quickly marched his soldiers across the island of Leon, a sprawling expanse of salty marshes, to intercept. By the end of the grueling trek, his ragtag band of soldiers was left gasping for a drink. While the troops made camp, Cecil discovered a nearby building stocked with wine. Eager to quench his soldiers' thirst and lift their morale, he opened the barrels and let his men drink to their heart's content. Cecil had just made a huge mistake. The English forces ended up drinking the barrels dry on empty stomachs. Like soccer hooligans on a budget Spanish holiday, they quickly descended into chaos, rioting, brawling with their superior officers, and even turning on each other in drunken fights. Seeing how broken his forces had become, Cecil ordered the withdrawal the next day. He left behind 100 soldiers who were still too drunk to walk. Alongside mounds of equipment, his troops were too hungover to hoist back to the ships. We'll say it again, don't drink and soldier. But it got even worse for Cecil. With his men back on their ships, he might have considered trying another attack on the Spanish fleet. That wasn't going to happen. Spain had moved its ships into an inlet, creating a blockade that left England's hungover sailors with no chance of winning a direct fight. In the end, Cecil had no choice but to pack up and sail back home. His mission? An unmitigated disaster. Then, the plague broke out amongst his men. Cecil made another mistake by sending the few healthy men he had left to the plague-ridden ships in exchange for sick men. He hoped to at least keep the vessels crewed so they could sail on. Of course, he only spread the disease among the entire force. A final and devastating end to a terrible campaign. By now you've seen a healthy mix of England making dumb war mistakes and sometimes redeeming itself. That's not going to stop just yet, as we move on to the most famous British military blunder of all. Number 3. The Charge of the Light Brigade. The Charge of the Light Brigade is remembered in British military history as both a catastrophic blunder and an act of gallantry that teetered on the edge of sheer madness. The truth is, all of these assessments are fair. What makes it even sadder for England is that it started so well. During the early stages of the 1854 Battle of Balaclava, British troops successfully held back Russian cavalry. In fact, Britain's heavy brigade had even managed to force a retreat, setting the stage for what should have been a decisive victory. But there was a problem. British Army Commander Lord Raglan had one nagging concern: the heavy guns his troops had abandoned in the Causeway Heights area of the battlefield. He thought that the retreating Russians might seize those guns and turn them against Britain, and honestly, it made sense. Why let a retreating enemy take your weapons? Raglan sent Captain Lewis Edward Nolan of the 15th Light Dragoons to deliver the order to retake the guns to Lord Lucan, who commanded Britain's cavalry division. But there was a problem. Nolan wasn't exactly clear about which guns Lucan was supposed to target. When Lucan asked for clarification, Nolan simply swept his arm and declared, "There, my lord, is your enemy. There are your guns." The problem was that Nolan's sweeping gesture pressed over the valley between the Causeway Heights and the Fedyukin Heights, an area later dubbed the Valley of Death. Charging into it would see Lucan's cavalry face fire from both flanks and the front if he was foolish enough to send his soldiers into it. So did Lucan ask for clarification? Of course he didn't. Assuming Raglan had ordered his cavalry to take the Russian guns in the valley, Lucan relayed those orders to the Light Brigade commander Lord Cardigan. The British were about to charge the wrong target, and nothing would stop them. The 670 troops of the Light Brigade lined up ready for action. At Cardigan's command, they advanced, first at a steady trot, then to a full gallop, heading straight for the Valley of Death. The Russians couldn't believe what they were seeing. Britain had just brought those horses and sabers to a gunfight. Amazingly, some of the Light Brigade managed to make it through half a mile of relentless artillery fire and reach the Russian gun positions. But what awaited them was a horse-mounted artillery and cavalry force 3 times their size, sabers drawn and ready to strike. The survivors quickly realized there was no chance of capturing the guns. So with no other option, they wheeled around and charged back up the valley, desperate to reach safety. The crazy charge ended up killing 113 soldiers and injuring 143 more. Britain also lost hundreds of its horses, all for an attack that had no chance of succeeding. Still, at least the whole fiasco was immortalized in a poem by Alfred Tennyson, so there's that. Of course, the Charge of the Light Brigade is far from the only hopeless attack caused by a dumb war mistake. Number 2. The Battle of Little Bighorn. Our next entry is less a mistake and more a series of dumb blunders that have gone down in history for all the wrong reasons. In fact, the maker of all of these mistakes, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, has been lauded as an American hero for his famous last stand at the Battle of Little Bighorn. It was a last stand of his own making. After Sioux Chiefs Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse refused to accept peace with the U.S. forces in 1868, General Philip Sheridan was tasked with resolving the so-called Native American issue. Sheridan met with Generals Alfred Terry and John Gibbon, and together they devised a plan. Gibbon would move up the Little Bighorn River, while George Custer would march around the Wolf Mountains, setting up a classic pincer attack on the Sioux camp. The problem was Custer made mistake after mistake along the way. Apparently desperate for glory, he ignored the plan and hit the Sioux camp early, without waiting for Gibbon to position his forces. To make matters worse, Custer marched his soldiers through the Wolf Mountains instead of around them, leaving his troops exhausted before the fight even began. And the mistakes kept on coming. What Custer didn't realize was just how outnumbered he was. The Sioux had allied with Arapaho and Cheyenne warriors, amassing a force of 3,000 armed with Winchester rifles. By contrast, Custer had only 600 men, leaving him outnumbered 5-1. And then he made things worse. Following standard U.S. military tactics of the time, Custer divided his already outnumbered force into 3 groups, a risky move under any circumstances, but downright disastrous when facing 3,000 fighters and launching the attack far earlier than planned. Custer's arrogance also played a role in his defeat. For some reason, he expected his enemy to scatter and run as soon as his forces descended upon them. He completely underestimated the determination driving his opponents. The Sioux were prepared to treat the Battle of Little Bighorn as their last stand. And then there were Custer's political ambitions. With dreams of running for president someday, he saw this battle as an opportunity to secure a glorious victory over the Sioux, a personal triumph that would look much better on his campaign resume than sharing the credit with other American forces. The result is well known in American history. The 210 men Custer had led as part of his small group were destroyed over the course of 2 hours. The only survivor from his battalion was a single horse named Comanche, who spent the rest of his life appearing in parades for the 7th Cavalry. Still, for all of Custer's mistakes, he at least tried to prepare for a battle. That's more than we can say for our last blunderer. Number 1. Santa Anna gets caught napping. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna believed himself to be the Napoleon of the West, and with good reason. His Mexican army had already claimed 2 decisive victories over Texas at Goliad and the Alamo. These successes left him confident that his battles with the independence-seeking Texans were nearly over. Under his leadership, Texas would remain firmly a part of Mexico, or so he believed. His first mistake was the slaughter of the 342 Texans his Mexican forces had captured at Goliad. That unified Texas like never before. From its peace-loving citizens to the ethnic Mexican Tejanos, everyone was calling for Santa Anna's death. Next up was Santa Anna's decision on where to camp, as he prepared to do battle with General Samuel Houston's ragtag group of soldiers. Santa Anna set up camp on the San Jacinto Prairie. It was a marshy, forested territory that was completely alien to them, but well known to the Texans he was about to fight. Still, those mistakes didn't spell Santa Anna's doom. When Houston arrived with a force of 1,300, Mexico's 700 troops lost, though reinforcements were on the way. With 1,200 troops now at his command, Santa Anna waited for Texas to make its next move. By noon of April 20th, 1836, that move hadn't come. So Santa Anna issued a command: nap time. And not just nap time, Mexico's president decided to go to sleep without posting any guards around his camp. You can guess how that worked out. The Texans attacked at 4:30 p.m. A staggering 650 Mexicans died compared to just 11 Texans. Santa Anna managed to wake up during the chaos, but by then it was far too late. He was captured, and Texas had secured its first major victory over Mexico. What do you think is the dumbest war mistake on our list? Know any more? Share your thoughts below. Now go check out Embarrassingly Stupid Ways People Died Darwin Award winners, or click on this video instead.